2 days before his crucifixion, Jesus Christ led his disciples through the streets of Jerusalem toward one of the ancient world's most magnificent buildings, the Jewish temple, reconstructed by the king Herod the Great. Here, surrounded by walls of marble and gold, 15 stories high, the disciples spoke excitedly about the splendor of Israel's most sacred structure. Unmoved by their enthusiasm, Christ stunned the 12 with a chilling prophecy.
Do you see these great buildings? I tell you, not one stone here shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.
Does Mark 13 speak of the end of the world? In this video, of course, I'm looking at the Olivet Discourse, as in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. And in the interest of keeping this video not too long, I'm therefore looking at Mark 13. But the equivalent, of course, would be true about those other two passages, I believe. First, I will walk through the passage step by step without getting too deep into the weeds. After that, I will point out some material facts that should determine our interpretation and also answer questions on difficult statements that need to be answered. Verses 1 and 2 set the stage. I will read. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." From here, Jesus and the disciples move to the Mount of Olives, which sits off to the side of the temple and overlooks the temple. In verses 3 and 4, the disciples ask Jesus privately two questions. When will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are to be accomplished? Let's read the two verses. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Why is it that so many Christian interpreters insert their own ideas into the term "these things"? The context, I think, is plain and simple. Verses 1 and 2 gave us the answer. These great buildings, and they will be destroyed, as in not one stone will be left upon another. There is no other referent for linking these things to insert 2,000 years into this passage to make it about some great and terrible tribulation today. That is inserting into the passage, I believe, what it plainly does not say. So how do interpreters arrive at this conclusion, I hear you ask? Well, hold that thought. We will get there later in our discussion. Verses 5 to verse 13 give us a list of clues as to what must take place leading up to this destruction of the temple Jesus initially referred to. Let's first list the signs, and after that we'll get into the details. Number 1, many will be led astray. We see that in verses 5 and 6. And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one will lead you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will lead many astray." Number 2, wars and natural disasters. We see that in verses 6, 7 and 8. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet.
In the spring of the year 70 CE, Titus marches his legions from the coastal plain to Jerusalem. He's boiling with anger. It has been 4 years, and the Roman army has not succeeded in suppressing the stubborn revolt that broke out in Judea. The Jews fight courageously for every piece of land. Even the esteemed commander Vespasian, Titus' father, could not defeat them.
Nero's reign as emperor had been a disaster, for reasons totally unrelated to the situation in Judea. But the dam finally broke in April 68, when the entire West revolted in support of a general named Sulpicius Galba. The Senate proclaimed Galba emperor, ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and Nero committed suicide. But now it was summer. The Jewish blockade had held, and now Italy was starving, pouring gasoline on the imperial fire. In January 69, Galba was overthrown by a general named Otho, who reigned for just 3 months before being overthrown by another general named Vitellius. By this time, the Jewish navy had collapsed, and Bar Giora was still fighting to consolidate his power in the mountains. This would have been the perfect time for Vespasian to lead another offensive. The Jewish factions had reunited, and Vespasian had missed his chance to take Jerusalem. However, Vespasian was not prevented at all from sending out sorties to occupy most of the hinterland north and west of the city. Within days of this countryside campaign, the legions finally proclaimed Vespasian emperor. Before long, the entire Roman East had joined his cause. The Danube legions had invaded Italy on his behalf, overthrowing Vitellius in December. In Vespasian's stead, Titus took over the war effort, with his father's 3 legions and a reconstituted 12th Fulminata.
For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. And bear in mind, without not yet getting into the detail, that of course all throughout our history we've had wars and we've had natural disasters. So those 2 items are extremely difficult to place in any precision without the other much more clearer signs. That's just on the side note. Item number 3, great persecution. We will see that in verses 9 and verse 12. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And item number 4, the gospel will be proclaimed to all nations. We see that in verse 10. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. So about the wars and natural disasters, my recommendation would be to read the historian of the 1st century, Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, and he writes extensively about the wars and natural disasters leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. We have therefore no reason to doubt the historicity of these events back then. Great persecution. One only needs to read the book of Acts to realize that the very early church, that consisted mostly of Jews to start with, was persecuted constantly and brutally. And importantly, it was persecuted by the Jews first, and then also by the Roman state. The gospel will be proclaimed to all nations. This is the first problem text that leads many to futurize this passage. We will soon see that Scripture itself documents the fulfillment of this passage in the 1st century. Now we move on to verses 14 to 23. Verses 15 to 17. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter into his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. We will deal specifically with the abomination of desolation shortly. Note here several localized events. Those who are in Judea, the one who is on the housetop. Here we will insert some typical photos of houses of that period. Note People often bathed and slept on the rooftops of their houses. Consider the Old Testament stories of Rahab the prostitute who helped the Israelite spies in Jericho, and Bathsheba bathing on the roof, as seen by King David. The law of Moses required houses to have protection around the edges to ensure people would not fall off, showing us the typical Jewish home architecture. All this strongly points to a localized event in a Judean setting, not a global event with a myriad of different housing and living situations. Let's move on to verses 17 to 19. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter, for in those days there will be such a tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now and never will be. Over 1 million Jews died in the most horrific ways during the months leading up to and including the siege of Jerusalem. This is the historic account of Josephus. Some say that is slightly exaggerated, it might have been less. I can't tell. This is the historic account that we've got. But even if it's only 800,000, it is still, at that period, the greatest and worst destructive event the Jews / Israelites had experienced. The historic account of Josephus in his The War of the Jews details the most horrific accounts of suffering and death, including the killing and eating of human baby flesh. Yes, the words of Jesus came to their chilling and ultimate fruition in this event. This means also that we have no reason to doubt that this account found its fulfillment in AD 70 and the destruction of the temple. Verses 20 to 23. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. In Acts chapter 5, verses 34 to 37, we see two false prophets named Theudas and Judas the Galilean, drawing many aside. In Acts chapter 8, verses 4 to 7, we see another false prophet called Simon the magician, also drawing people aside. Finally, we see in Acts chapter 13, verses 5 to 12, Jewish false prophet and magician Bar Jesus, or Elymas, struck blind by Paul. This is a man who also was drawing disciples aside. Jewish historian and Josephus and the New Testament scholar and historian John B. Lightfoot writes the following. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, who had made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get up on the temple, and there they should have received miraculous signs of their deliverance. Now there was then a great number of false prophets suborned by the tyrants to impose upon the people, who denounced this to them, that they should wait for deliverance from God, and this was in order to keep them from deserting, that they might be buoyed up above fear and care by such hopes. Now a man that is in adversity does not easily comply with such promises, for when such a seducer makes him believe that he shall be delivered from those miseries which oppress him, then it is that the patient is full of hopes of such deliverance. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers. These are obviously events leading up to the final destruction, as Roman General Titus had invaded Judea and was in the process of taking over and destroying Jerusalem. This is in Flavius Josephus' War of the Jews in 6:5-2-3. Again, John Lightfoot writes, false Christs broke out and appeared in public with their witchcraft, so much the frequenter and more impudent as the city and people drew nearer to its ruin. because the people believed the Messiah should be manifested before the destruction of the city, and each of them pretended to be messiahs by these signs. This is, as he writes in a commentary on the New Testament from the Talmud and the Hebraica in 318. There are 7 material facts or pointers showing this passage, as in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, as in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, cannot be about a future event. These facts demonstrate this passage cannot be about some future global tribulation event. And forcing a global worldwide future event onto this passage gives rise to legitimate questions of Jesus' accuracy, which is what has led many atheist philosophers to question the validity of Jesus' words. Let's see what these material facts are. Number 1, it is anchored in the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Number 2, Jesus refers to his disciples as the direct recipients and not a future audience. How so, I hear you ask? Well, verse 4 tells us, tell us when these things will be, as in tell us. Verse 5, Jesus said to them. Hereafter, Jesus never changes the referent to who he is addressing this, i.e., I am telling you what will happen in the distant future, and you must be faithful to pass it on to them. That is not how Jesus speaks and how you would expect him to speak if this was about a future event. Verse 5 leads you, the disciples, astray. Verse 7, when you, the disciples, hear of rumors of war. Verse 9, be on your guard, the disciples again. Bring you, verse 11, the disciples to trial and deliver you over what you are to say, for it is not you who speak. And again, of course, we notice there that they are delivered into the synagogues, which is the obvious thing that the Jews did, as we see in the book of Acts. Verse 13, you will be hated. So far, there are 10 direct audience references to the disciples themselves. They are the ones who will experience this. Number 3, the believers will be beaten in synagogues. We see this in verse 9. This is a reference to localized persecution there directly in Palestine, or the surrounding areas where there was Jewish presence and control. This only fits a localized event. Number 4, seeing the abomination of desolation where it ought not to be. This clearly refers to a historic event in Jerusalem's past and only makes sense for the people living in Judea. Number 5, those in Judea flee to the mountains. This is clearly a localized marker that makes no sense if this is a globalized event in the distant future. Number 6, the one who is on the housetop. Again, this only makes sense given the typical architecture of the first century in Jerusalem, where people gathered publicly on the rooftops of their houses. Number 7, pray that it may not happen in winter. This makes sense only for a localized event. If it was a global future event, clearly it is in winter on one side of the world and it is in summer on the other. This would turn Jesus' words into nonsense. There are 4 questions that arise from verses 5 through to verse 13, and these are what I would call difficult questions. But we must not reinterpret the straightforward and the simple and the clear by the items that are somewhat more obscure. Number 1, what does Jesus mean when he refers to the end in verse 7? Number 2, what do birth pains mean in verse 8? Number 3, what is all nations referring to in verse 10? Number 4, what is the abomination of desolation that Jesus clearly referred to as a specific event that they should look out for? Is there a past referent that the disciples would have known of? Question number 1. Many interpret end with the end of the world. That is mostly because we live 2,000 years later and quite naturally tend to view end from our perspective. But the audience, however, would have viewed this end from their perspective. They were living in the days of the end of the Old Testament or the Old Covenant era and reaching into the beginning of the New Covenant era. Jesus inaugurates the New Covenant at the Last Supper. The end here, more naturally referring to Jesus' audience, refers to the end of the Jewish age or the Mosaic covenant. Historically, it makes much more sense to the death, burial, and resurrection as the end of the Mosaic covenant age, with God giving a single generation of grace before finally wiping out the temple itself, and with it, its worship system, because the majority of Jews, as in God's people in Jesus' day, had rejected their Messiah. Sadly so. Question number 2. The birth pains, therefore quite naturally refer to the transition period between ending of the old Mosaic covenant and the inauguration of the new covenant. And a student of Old Testament prophets will realize that this is a frequent allusion to the build-up of a coming of God's judgment. Question number 3. All nations. Naturally, in our modern mind, since the discovery of the whole globe, this would refer to the earth's nations. But we must view this from the perspective of Jesus' primary audience. Luke chapter 2 verse 1 tells us that a decree went out from Caesar that all the world should be registered. No one in their right mind would think that that would refer to Aborigines living in Australia. Clearly, all the world here refers to the Roman world, and it therefore seems much more likely to a first century audience that all nations refers to the Roman world too. And we have warrant to believe this is true. In Colossians chapter 1 verse 6, Paul claims that the gospel was already bearing fruit in the whole world in his day. Now, clearly it wasn't here in Australia or in China or in Britain or America, but the whole world in his mind obviously meant the Roman world. And clearly the context there demands that Paul was speaking of the Roman world, as is evidence, of course, also by the remainder of his New Testament epistles. It is therefore a natural reading to view all nations as the nations known to the apostles then, the relevant nations to the relevant audience. This is simply allowing the text to speak for itself. Question number 4. The Abomination of Desolation is originally a prophetic phrase from the book of Daniel. There are several moments in Jewish history where pagan empirical leaders have committed what Jews understood to be this abomination of desolation. The Greek emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 168 BC invaded Judea, conquered Jerusalem, entered the temple, erected the statue of the Greek god Zeus, and forced the priests to sacrifice a pig on the altar in the temple. Well, not all the priests did so, but many did. Under the leadership of the Maccabees, then, the Jews revolted and drove out the Greek armies and their rulers out of Judea. About 100 years later, the Roman general Pompey captured the Holy Land, and this time erected the Roman standard inside the Holy of Holies in the temple. During the siege of Jerusalem, Titus once again brings the Roman standard ensigns into the temple and sacrificed to the Roman gods. The disciples would have recognized this from Jesus' words of warning to be a very clear historical referent.
Jewish holidays are not evenly distributed throughout the year. Titus took command in January, after which the next pilgrimage festival was Passover, when, again, a huge segment of Old Judea's population would make their way to the capital to make sacrifices at the temple. By encircling Jerusalem during this holiday, Titus hoped to maximize chaos within the city, pitting the rival factions against each other, while also depriving Simon Bar Giora of outlying peasant militias that could relieve the siege. Josephus made clear that Titus would show mercy if they surrendered now, and that the temple would be spared. But one defender, tired of hearing him speak, struck Josephus with a rock, knocking him unconscious. With surrender out of the question, A wall of circumvallation was built, and Jerusalem began to starve. Most were crucified, but when it was discovered that some of the citizens had swallowed their gold coins, 2,000 were disemboweled by the Syrian and Nabatean volunteers. In the chaos, the Romans steadily forced their way up the ruin, and as the priests sacrificed their last remaining lamb, the temple became a battlefield. The Romans reached the precipice of the inner courts on August 28th, a day known in the Hebrew calendar as the 9th of Av. Although Titus had promised the safety and integrity of the temple to Josephus, in the heat of the battle, Titus saw such an effort as folly. And in a single moment, a lone Roman centurion pitched his torch from atop the wall into the open door of the sanctuary. At the end of the day, the only living souls in the temple were Roman. The treasury had been so totally ransacked that it is said the price of gold in Syria fell 50%. Whatever few holy relics had survived the fire in the sanctuary were looted, including the great menorah. Greeted in the charred space by vast cheers of Imperator, Titus embraced his men, sacrificed a pig on the altar, and ordered the temple destroyed.
Now to the difficult verses 24 to 27, the cataclysmic or somewhat poetic language. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. Here we have two very important and valid questions. What is this cataclysmic language to mean? And two, what is this coming of Christ that most today just simply mean it's the second coming of Christ? This is probably the prime reason why many modern readers conclude this hasn't happened, therefore it must be a future event. Question number one. The cataclysmic language is a common literary device in the writings of the Old Testament prophets. When they write about the downfall or judgment of nations, there are several examples of this that are widely accepted as past historic events. Please read the passages for yourself and compare the language of the Old Testament prophets with the words of Jesus. Each of these are historic, real, past events of historic judgment that use very similar cataclysmic or poetic language to describe a real event. Isaiah chapter 13, note verse 10. It reads almost identical to Mark 13:24. It's as if Jesus directly quoted it. Yet it was the historic judgment on Babylon in punishment for deporting the Jews to Babylon. In Isaiah 34, we see similar language about the judgment of Edom. Jeremiah 48, the judgment on Moab. Jeremiah 49, again the judgment on Edom. Ezekiel 26, the judgment on Tyre. Zephaniah chapter 1, and many more. Cataclysmic language with poetic exaggeration in inverted commas is a common literary device in the writings of the Old Testament prophets. We therefore have no license to ignore this and make the words of Jesus about a far distant future event with no textual links to his words just because we don't understand that type of language, or we have failed to interpret it in light of the Old Testament prophets. Question number two. The Son of Man coming in the clouds with great glory. Power and glory, sorry. We must remember that the first century Jews would have been steeped in the language of the Old Testament prophets. This statement is a direct quote from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Without getting into the weeds of Daniel 7, 13, and 14 tells us a few things that show us that it is not the second coming of Christ that is in view here in the Gospel of Mark. One, He comes on the clouds of heaven, but he comes to the Ancient of Days. So this is not about coming to the earth. This is not about his second coming, where the Bible clearly states that all flesh will see it. Number two, he was presented before him, as in the Ancient of Days, and to him was given a kingdom. This passage is much more likely to be associated with the ascension of Christ and being seated at the right hand of the Father to receive his rightful place as ruler of his kingdom. Without getting into too much detail, it is perfectly reasonable, therefore, to not see this as the second coming, and given the unsurmountable hurdles of the much more plain parts of the passage, it seems much more likely that this passage is about the transition of the old to the new covenant era. In closing, this video was my short attempt to whet your appetite to study this more deeply, and also acts as a solid, I think, refutation of modern doom and gloom folk who seek to capitalize on the fear of their audience and lack of historical knowledge and lack of proper biblical exegesis. Finally, and importantly, I believe in the second coming of Christ, as per all the historic Christian creeds, and is evidenced by passages like Acts 1, and there are many more. So, in other words, you can happily view the Olivet Discourse as events in the first century, and you are not thereby suddenly falling for the so-called attack that many futurists claim that you might fall for, that the second coming of Christ is not a thing. That is a non sequitur, as in the conclusion does not follow from the premise. So to restate this, viewing the Olivet Discourse as fulfilled in AD 70 does not mean you have to deny the second coming of Christ. And bear in mind, some preterists do this. I do not. There are ample other passages in the New Testament that predict the second coming of Christ. And it is therefore a non sequitur to say that because you believe the Olivet Discourse is fulfilled in the first century, therefore Jesus is not coming again. So one does not have to deny the second coming of Christ in order to believe a preterist fulfillment of Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. And considering this is especially so in Matthew 24, where the strong reference to this generation, which is made many times in the Gospel of Matthew and always in the Gospel of Matthew prior to chapter 24, means a real literal generation, as it means it's an audience that Jesus is referring to, the people who he is talking to. It is very difficult to jump out of that context and then suddenly insert a 2,000 year passage. That is doing what I would call biblical gymnastics, because you don't want to let the passage say what it is really saying. Sometimes one has to put your own thoughts to the side and let the text speak. And as you do, I believe an honest student of the passage will recognize the plain English statements of this passage that drive the, I think, very clear interpretation of it. I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope that you do your own research and your own study.
Step aside, babe. Let a star do this. That's all!
That's all, folks!
Can I go home now?